My trusted son-in-law framed me for theft, but the bigger betrayal came from the one person who made my morning coffee. Now I'm facing prison, and my entire world was stolen by the woman I trusted most. The smell of freshly brewed coffee usually brought a sense of calm to my mornings, a ritual I'd perfected over 3 decades of marriage and 2 decades of running my own successful contracting business. But this Tuesday, the aroma felt thick, almost suffocating, clinging to the expensive oak grain of my kitchen island like a threat. I leaned against the counter, gripping my mug so tightly my knuckles were white, staring out at the manicured lawn that separated my quiet suburban haven from the chaos brewing just next door. That chaos had a name, Mark, my son-in-law. And Sarah, my daughter, bless her naive, loving heart, was currently caught in the crossfire, trying to mediate a situation that was rapidly deteriorating into a full-blown war. It all started subtly, as these things always do. Mark, bless his ambitious, albeit clumsy soul, had always been a little too eager to impress me. He'd married Sarah 5 years ago, and while I genuinely liked him initially, he was charming, outgoing, seemed to adore my daughter. His business acumen was questionable. He'd started a small tech repair shop after leaving his corporate gig, and frankly, it was floundering. He needed capital, and he needed a win. I run Sterling & Sons Construction. We're not huge, but we're reputable. We deal in high-end renovations, often involving valuable materials, custom millwork, imported granite, antique fixtures. I pride myself on meticulous inventory control. 2 weeks ago, I received a call that made my stomach drop. It was Detective Miller from the local precinct. Apparently, a shipment of specialized German industrial drills, worth about $15,000 easily, had gone missing from the secure staging yard 2 nights prior. The police had an anonymous tip. The tip pointed directly at me. I laughed when I hung up the phone, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. Me? A man who had built his reputation on integrity? But the laughter died quickly. The tip hadn't just pointed at the company, it had pointed at my personal office trailer on site, and it mentioned specific details only someone familiar with my internal inventory manifests could know. I immediately started digging, reviewing my own security logs. Nothing amiss. My foreman, Gus, swore blind that the yard was locked down tight. But the police were interested. They wanted to interview me. That's when Sarah, teary-eyed and worried, confessed. Mark had been desperate for money. He'd borrowed heavily from loan sharks, something he'd kept secret, and he'd apparently tried to borrow those drills to flip them quickly, under the table, to a fence he knew. But he hadn't taken them. He claimed someone else was involved, but the pressure was on him. Then the bombshell dropped. Mark, in a panic move to deflect suspicion from himself, had insinuated to a friend, who happened to be friendly with a beat cop, that I was staging the theft. His theory? That I was trying to claim insurance money on old equipment and needed a scapegoat. It was absurd, defamatory, and utterly soul-crushing. I could have called my lawyer immediately, but something stopped me. I looked at Sarah's devastated face, and I thought about Mark, my son-in-law, the man I'd offered advice and mentorship to, twisting this whole narrative to save his own skin. He had thrown me under the bus, publicly. That's when I remembered the old workshop. My grandfather built it 50 years ago, attached to the back of the main garage, mostly used for storing seasonal decorations and old tools. It was soundproofed, completely independent of the main house wiring, and more importantly, it was where I kept my other security equipment. I'm a meticulous man. I don't trust anyone completely, especially when high-value assets are involved. Years ago, When I had a brief spate of vandalism on a downtown property, I'd installed a specialized military-grade, completely off-grid surveillance system in strategic locations around my property. Places a standard contractor wouldn't think to look, much less disable. They ran on independent batteries, streamed data via a low-frequency encrypted signal to a hidden server rack I built into the concrete foundation of that old workshop. I spent the next 72 hours working non-stop. I dusted off the old blueprints for the workshop, retrieved the proprietary access keycard, and located the server rack behind a false panel disguised as a workbench shelf. The power indicator glowed a faint, reassuring blue. I bypassed the office trailer logs entirely. Mark wouldn't have tried to steal the drills from there anyway. That was the bait. He would have targeted the easiest access point for someone unfamiliar with the main yard perimeter. I focused the cameras on the area where the break-in should have occurred, according to the police report, and the small access road leading from the back of my property toward the neighboring woods, the route someone would take to avoid street cameras. I queued up the footage from the night of the supposed theft, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The screen flickered, displaying the grainy infrared view of the empty yard. Nothing. Then, as the timeline approached 2:17 a.m., movement. 2 figures masked, hauling large, dark bags. They moved with practice speed. My hand started shaking as I zoomed in on the figures. The first one was tall, broad-shouldered. That matched Mark's build. The second was shorter, leaner. As the taller figure turned slightly toward the camera before ducking behind a stack of pallets, the low light caught the distinctive, slightly scuffed leather patch on the left shoulder of his jacket. It was a jacket I had bought Mark for Christmas last year. A very distinct, expensive Italian leather jacket. But as I leaned closer, about to confirm that my son-in-law was indeed the thief, the shorter figure reached up, fumbling with his mask. The low light hit his face for a split second, and I saw a flash of familiar silver hair just beneath the brim of a cap. It wasn't Mark who was the mastermind. It was Gus, my foreman, standing right there next to my son-in-law, clearly complicit in the theft and setting us both up. But wait. Gus had been at his daughter's graduation party on the other side of the state that night, a fact confirmed by dozens of social media posts. My blood ran cold. If that wasn't Gus, then who was the second man wearing Gus's favorite cap, and why were they stealing my drills? And if Mark wasn't the primary thief, why was he so desperate to pin the whole thing on me? I scrubbed back the footage a few minutes, focusing on the initial approach. The 2 figures stopped near the perimeter fence. The taller one, Mark, didn't look eager or hurried. He looked nervous, but also instructional. He pointed toward the gate latch. Then the shorter figure, the imposter, pulled something out of his jacket pocket, something metallic that glinted under the infrared light, and he used it to swiftly disable the electronic lock. It wasn't a standard bypass tool. It was a keycard that looked identical to the one I used for the staging yard access logs. I paused the footage, leaning back in my chair, the stale air of the workshop suddenly difficult to breathe. I knew exactly who had access to those keycards, besides myself. The list was 5 names long, one of whom was Sarah. But the true horror dawned when I looked at the timestamp again. The break-in happened at 2:17 a.m. I checked my phone. I'd been watching a movie with my wife until nearly 1 a.m. that night. My wife, who had been upstairs, supposedly asleep, while I was down here downloading evidence. I checked the second camera feed, the one focused on the main living room windows, which I kept running for basic property monitoring. It showed the exterior light near the kitchen flickering on and off exactly 3 times at 1:45 a.m. a signal. And then I remembered the conversation from last week when Sarah and Mark were having a loud, whispered argument in the driveway, and Mark had yelled, "If you don't do exactly what I say, the insurance won't cover anything." It wasn't just Mark trying to frame me. Sarah knew everything, and she was communicating with the other thief from inside the house, signaling when the coast was clear. I looked at the monitor, heart hammering, and saw a tiny, almost invisible smudge on the lower left corner of the screen, right where the glass met the frame of the window. It was a smear of cheap, bright red lipstick, the exact shade Sarah always wore. I felt the betrayal like a physical blow, worse than the threat of prison. They were working together, my daughter and my son-in-law. But if Sarah was the lookout and Mark was the muscle, who was the skilled second thief with Gus's cap and the access card? I furiously started cross-referencing the height, gait, and jacket measurements of the second figure against every employee I had. Nothing matched perfectly. Defeated, I slumped back, ready to call my lawyer and blow the whole thing open, when my monitor suddenly flashed a system alert. External command received. Server wipe initiated. My hidden server, the one disconnected from the internet, the one locked in a concrete bunker, was being remotely wiped. Someone knew exactly where the proof was hidden, and they were deleting it right now. I scrambled for the emergency disconnect switch, but before my hand could hit the cold steel lever, the main screen went black, replaced by a single, high-resolution still image pulled from one of the perimeter cameras. It was a close-up of the second thief's face, the one I thought was Gus's imposter. The mask had slipped completely this time, and the features staring back at me weren't a stranger or my foreman or even Mark. It was my business partner of 20 years, Robert. And Robert was holding a burner phone, looking directly into the lens, a slow, triumphant smirk spreading across his face as the final countdown timer for the data wipe hit 0. The smirk on Robert's face was a grotesque caricature of the easygoing smile he usually reserved for closing $1 million deal. 20 years. 20 years of shared risk, shared success, and shared trust, all dissolving into the cold digital annihilation of my evidence. The server wipe completed with a soft, almost mocking chime. Silence descended in the workshop, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. Robert. It explained everything. The meticulous planning, the intimate knowledge of the yard's blind spots, the access card. He'd always had one, even before I made him a full partner. He was the quiet architect behind Mark's frantic attempts at theft, using my desperate son-in-law as a distraction, a noisy puppet to draw police attention away from the real target. Not the drills, but something else entirely. But why the elaborate staging? Why bring Mark into a scheme that would, if exposed, implicate Robert too? And why the false identity of Gus? I lunged for the main house door, adrenaline overriding the crushing weight of the betrayal. I had to stop Sarah, stop this before she compounded her mistake by believing Robert's manufactured story. I burst through the workshop door, through the attached garage, and slammed into the kitchen. "Sarah," I bellowed, my voice rough from disuse. The kitchen was empty. The coffee pot was cold, the morning newspaper still folded neatly on the island where I'd left it an hour ago. Sarah's car, the old blue sedan she drove for errands, was gone from the driveway. I raced to the hallway closet, tearing through coats until I found my emergency satellite phone, the one I kept for remote sites. I needed to call my lawyer, call the police, tell them Robert was the mastermind, but I needed proof of his involvement that wasn't on that wiped server. My phone screen flared to life, but instead of the dial pad, a single text message dominated the display. It was from an unknown number. "Looking for this, Dad? Too bad I had to clean up your mess." Attached was a photo. It was the German drill kit, all $15,000 worth, loaded into the back of Robert's unmarked white service van. But next to the drills, nestled among the foam padding, was another item. My original leather-bound ledger from 1998, the one containing all my original business contracts, private tax records, and the handwritten notes detailing the offshore holdings I'd set up years ago when Sarah was born. Assets only Robert and I knew existed. Robert hadn't been framing me for theft. He was framing me for embezzlement and fraud, using the stolen drills as the shiny object to distract the authorities, while he secured the real evidence that could ruin me financially and legally. I stared at the ledger, the weight of decades of hard work suddenly feeling fragile. If Robert had that, he didn't just want me gone, he wanted me erased. I threw the phone onto the counter, spinning towards the back door. I had to get to Robert's office immediately. He wouldn't have had time to transfer the ledger far. Robert's office was downtown, in the old industrial park we shared, a separate building. Heavily alarmed, but I knew the master override code. I grabbed my heavy coat and my briefcase, not for clothes, but for the emergency lock-picking tools I kept tucked beneath my laptop sleeve. I didn't bother with keys. I needed speed, not subtlety. As I backed my truck out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the rear window of my house in the dimly lit hallway, I saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was Sarah. She wasn't crying or looking distressed. She was perfectly still, watching me leave with an expression of cold, detached disappointment. She raised her hand slowly, not to wave goodbye, but to press something small and black against her ear. I floored the accelerator. 10 minutes later, the industrial park loomed, silent under the weak pre-dawn glow. I parked my truck half on the curb near Robert's office entrance. The steel roll-down gate was firmly shut, secured with the heavy-duty padlock I insisted on for all our premises. Perfect. I pulled out my lockpicks, the familiar cold steel reassuring in my trembling hands. 2 minutes later, the satisfying clunk signaled the gate was open. I slipped through and approached the main door, ready to input the emergency code. But as I reached for the keypad, I noticed something was wrong. The small, usually bright red indicator light next to the keypad wasn't red. It was pulsing a slow, rhythmic green, and there was no dust on the keypad. It had been wiped recently. Robert had anticipated this. He knew I'd come for the ledger. I didn't bother with the code. I smashed the reinforced glass panel next to the door with the heel of my boot, ignoring the spray of tempered shards. The interior office was dark, but the faint glow of a single desk lamp illuminated the room. Robert was sitting at his desk, not looking panicked, but serene. The ledger was open in front of him. Next to it sat a small antique pistol, the kind my father used to keep in his nightstand. "Took you long enough, George," Robert said, his voice calm, almost bored. He didn't move for the gun. He just tapped the open page of the ledger with a manicured index finger. "Did you really think that little security rig in the workshop would be enough? I installed your security system 20 years ago, remember? Before you even hired that IT idiot who tipped off the police about the drills." My mind raced. Robert had installed my security? "You set me up with the drills," I spat, stepping further into the room, staying just outside arm's reach of the desk. "You framed me." "Stupid boy," Robert sighed, shaking his head, the smirk back. "I didn't frame you for theft, George. I framed Mark for theft, and I framed you for covering it up. That was the initial play. The drills were bait. Sarah was the distraction. She's been my eyes and ears in your house since Mark got into debt. She loves you, but she loves her security more." He leaned forward conspiratorially, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "You see, George, the ledger isn't about offshore accounts anymore. It's about the original land deeds for this entire industrial park, signed over to me as a partner dividend back when we were first building this place. You never noticed because I swapped the pages out 5 years ago when you trusted me with the archives for safekeeping." He raised the antique pistol, not aiming it at me, but placing the cold black barrel against his own temple. "But the beautiful part is, I don't need to wipe the server anymore, George. I have the originals here, and when the police arrive, which they will shortly, thanks to a very anonymous tip about a break-in at Robert's office, they'll find the ledger open to the fraudulent deeds, and they'll find me, dead by my own hand, a victim of corporate betrayal. And you, George, the only other person with access to these archives, will be the prime suspect for my murder and the mastermind behind the entire fraud scheme." He looked directly at me, a final lethal challenge in his eyes. "You're too late, George. You walked right into my perfectly set trap." Suddenly, the office phone rang, a shrill, insistent sound cutting through the tension. Robert looked at it, startled, pulling the gun away from his head just an inch. It was the first unexpected variable in his perfect equation. He reached slowly for the receiver, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door, knowing the call was probably the police responding to the break-in alarm he'd triggered. "Who is it?" I demanded, taking a step closer. Robert picked up the phone, holding it loosely. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was not the police. It was Sarah. Her voice was steady, almost serene, just as it had been from the upstairs window. "Robert," she said clearly into the phone, her voice amplified slightly by the desk speakerphone. "It's over. Dad beat you to the punch." Robert froze, dropping the receiver. On the desk, the ledger was no longer open to the deeds. It was open to a completely different page, one I hadn't seen, detailing a complex trust fund established in 1998. Next to the trust fund details, scrawled in sharp black ink that looked suspiciously fresh, was one single damning sentence. All assets transferred to Sarah Sterling upon filing a felony misappropriation report, effective 7 a.m., filed by G. Sterling. My wife, Eleanor, the quiet coffee-brewing woman I trusted implicitly, had not been asleep upstairs. She had been coordinating the entire event, not just with Sarah, but against Robert, playing a long, secret game against her own partner. And she had just filed the paperwork that legally transferred every single asset we jointly owned, including the controlling shares of Sterling and Sons, out of Robert's reach and into her own name, 5 minutes before Robert planned to kill himself and frame me. Robert spun around, his face a mask of pure fury, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered by the one person he thought was an unreliable civilian. He looked from the ledger to the phone, then back at me, the pistol now aimed directly at my chest. "She played us both!" he roared, pulling the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small, enclosed office, a violent punctuation mark against the years of quiet corporate maneuvering. But it wasn't the sharp crack of my life ending that I registered first. It was the sickening click of a misfire. Robert's face contorted in disbelief as the antique pistol remained stubbornly silent. He pumped the slide furiously, his expensive Italian leather jacket sleeve riding up to reveal a pale, veined wrist. He tried again, pulling the trigger with savage intensity, but only produced another empty, mocking click. He stared at the gun as if it had personally betrayed him. No, impossible. In that split second of mechanical failure, I moved, not with the calculated precision of a seasoned criminal, but with the desperate primal rage of a cornered man fighting for his life and his legacy. I didn't go for Robert. I went for the open ledger on the desk. My briefcase was still clutched in my left hand. I swung the heavy aluminum case in a wide, desperate arc, connecting with the side of Robert's head where the earlier impact from the desk corner hadn't quite stunned him. The impact was solid. Robert gasped, a high, thin sound, and tumbled sideways off his chair, hitting the linoleum floor hard. The useless pistol skittered across the polished surface, stopping near the waste bin. I stood over him, chest heaving, the adrenaline making the air taste metallic. I didn't look at the ledger. I looked at the pistol. I reached down, snatched it up, checked the chamber. Empty. He hadn't even bothered to load it, relying entirely on the deception and the pre-arranged police call. "You should have checked your props, Robert," I ground out, leveling the cold steel at his prone form. I learned how to check my equipment the first time I bought a drill press in 1985. Robert was dazed but starting to regain focus, pushing himself up onto one elbow, his eyes darting between me and the open door. "It doesn't matter, George. The transfer went through at 7 on the dot. Even if I die here, you're broke. Eleanor just signed away everything you built." "Eleanor?" I echoed, confusion momentarily overriding my need for vengeance. "Eleanor didn't file that report. Sarah wouldn't have done that to her own mother, and my wife wouldn't have moved against me." Robert laughed, a wet hacking sound that confirmed his insanity. "Oh, George, you really are the most predictable man alive. You think Eleanor cared about your legitimate business. She cared about the money you kept hidden from her, the money you stashed in that offshore account, detailed in Section C of that ledger. She didn't trust your wife-sister bond with Sarah. She knew Sarah was weak. Eleanor used Mark's debt, used Sarah's devotion, and used my scheme to get the leverage she needed to walk away with the real prize." He pointed a shaky finger at the ledger. "She filed a simultaneous report, a very specific one, claiming you were embezzling into that trust fund, making her the sole legal trustee to protect the assets from your supposed criminal activities. She's not just the beneficiary, she's the administrator. She's cleaner than a newborn." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Eleanor, my rock, the woman who made my coffee every morning, had been running a parallel long-term extraction plan. The quiet divorce preparation she'd hinted at was actually a sophisticated, hostile takeover executed while I was busy playing defense against my son-in-law and my partner. I stumbled back a step, my grip loosening on the pistol. The world tilted. The theft, the framing, Robert's attempted murder, they were all just noise, theater designed to keep my attention fixed firmly on the periphery while Eleanor quietly dismantled my entire financial foundation. "Where is she?" I whispered, my voice stripped bare of anger, replaced by sheer emptiness. Robert coughed, tasting blood, but his triumphant look returned, even through the throbbing lump on his temple. "Gone. 5 minutes after she filed that report, she took the private jet you bought her last anniversary. Destination, Zurich. She's untouchable. And you," he spat the word, "are standing over a dead body holding a gun that proves you killed me to stop me from exposing your actual crimes." Just as he finished his damning accusation, the silence outside the office door shattered. The blare of multiple sirens, not just a single precinct car, but the heavy, approaching sound of multiple police cruisers and, alarmingly, a tactical response unit, screamed down the Industrial Park access road. They were not responding to a simple break-in. They were responding to a homicide in progress, likely alerted by the gunshot Eleanor knew would happen. Robert grinned, a terrifyingly manic expression. "They're here, George, and you're holding the murder weapon with motive, opportunity, and a mountain of fabricated evidence pointing right at you. I win." He wasn't moving to fight. He was resigned to his fate, knowing he'd been outplayed financially, but assured of my legal destruction. I looked down at the antique pistol in my hand, then at the open door where the sirens were growing deafening, and finally at the ledger detailing my utter ruin. The evidence that proved Robert's fraud against me was right there, next to the documents proving Eleanor's financial coup, but I couldn't access any of it without being arrested for shooting Robert. There was only one way out, one move left on the board that wasn't accounted for in Robert's perfect scenario, the one element he hadn't considered when he set up his supposed suicide. I didn't raise the gun toward Robert. I didn't raise it toward the door. I looked down at the antique weapon again, remembering the specific weight and feel. I flicked the hammer back, not to fire, but to expose the firing pin mechanism. I didn't aim at Robert. I aimed at the open ledger, specifically at the section outlining the fraudulent transfer of the industrial park land to Robert. "You think you won because you anticipated my next move, Robert," I said, my voice regaining its old, firm cadence. "But you forgot one thing about me. I never trusted the tools other people give me, not even my own dead father's gun." I squeezed the trigger, aiming at the mechanism itself, not the paper. The antique pistol, already prone to misfiring, detonated under the focused pressure. It didn't explode violently, but the impact against the firing pin housing shattered the cheap, brittle metal, sending a shrapnel spray of brass and steel directly across the desk. One sharp piece of metal, traveling at incredible speed, glanced off the side of the open ledger and lodged itself deep, precisely into the micro SD card slot of the small, sophisticated digital recorder I always kept clipped inside my briefcase, the one I instinctively dropped onto the desk right before I picked up the pistol. The sound of the explosion inside the gun drowned out the sirens for a half-second. When the dust settled, Robert stared, his victory stolen again. The recorder, though visibly damaged by the debris, was still blinking a tiny, unbroken, amber light, the indicator that it was recording. The entire conversation, Robert admitting to setting up Mark, confirming Eleanor's betrayal, and detailing the land fraud. It was all captured. But as I knelt to retrieve the smoking recorder, the main office door burst inward, not with police tactical officers, but with two men in dark suits and bulletproof vests, their weapons drawn, aiming not at me, but at Robert. They weren't local law enforcement. They were professionals responding with lethal speed. One of the men barked into a wrist mic, "Target neutralized. Secure the civilian. We have the ledger." They weren't here for Robert's suicide. They were here for the ledger. The lead agent leveled his rifle at me, ignoring the injured Robert completely. "George Sterling, hands in the air slowly. You are in possession of stolen federal property. Do not move." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum solo against the sudden, chilling silence of the heavily armed men in my vicinity. Federal property. The ledger detailed a local corporate land dispute, not a federal offense, unless the documents Eleanor filed were far more explosive than I imagined. "Federal?" I managed, my voice a ragged croak as I slowly raised my hands, the ruined antique pistol still clutched tightly in my right. The tactical agents ignored the weapon, their focus entirely on my proximity to Robert and the open ledger. The lead agent, a man whose expression seemed permanently carved into granite, stepped forward, his weapon tracking my every tremor. The ledger contains proprietary schematics for Phase 4 defense infrastructure subcontracted under Sterling and Sons. You violated national security protocols, Mr. Sterling. Drop the weapon and step away from the desk. Robert, still on the floor, let out a low, guttural laugh that was utterly devoid of mirth. You see, George, even Eleanor couldn't stop this train. She thought she could play the corporate game. She didn't know who she was stealing from. I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. My small-time betrayal drama with a son-in-law and a disloyal partner had just somehow involved national defense contracts and clandestine federal agencies. The stolen German drills, they weren't just expensive construction equipment. They were components, disguised as industrial tools. I didn't know about any schematics, I insisted, slowly easing the useless pistol toward the floor. I thought it was construction deeds. Your ignorance is noted but irrelevant, the agent countered, his voice flat and utterly devoid of negotiation. The device you just destroyed, he nodded towards my smoking briefcase, was transmitting encrypted data logs matching those we've been tracking for months. You just destroyed the only decryption key we had. I looked down at the damaged recorder, realizing Eleanor hadn't just played me and Robert. She had likely been working for this mysterious federal entity all along, using her divorce as cover to seize control of data that implicated everyone. Before I could process the horrifying scope of Eleanor's double cross, the second agent moved swiftly, ignoring both me and the groaning Robert. He snatched the open ledger from the desk, flipped rapidly through the pages, then stopped dead at the section detailing the Zurich Trust Fund. He looked up at the lead agent, his eyes wide. Sir, this trust fund, it's listed as the primary conduit for the offshore payments. It's clean, but the beneficiary is listed as Eleanor Sterling. She's the key. The lead agent grunted, shifting his focus entirely from me to the phone that Sarah had used. No, the call came from inside this building. It was a distraction to draw us here before our surveillance caught the actual target. He looked at Robert, who was trying desperately to sit up. Where is your wife, Robert? Where is Eleanor Sterling? Robert shook his head weakly. Zurich. Jet left at 7:05. She's gone. The agent didn't believe him. He turned back to me, his face hardening. Mr. Sterling, you are under arrest. You will answer every question regarding the location and transfer methods of Eleanor Sterling. The sirens outside had finally ceased their wail, replaced by the heavy thudding of boots approaching the main entrance. I was trapped between the feds who thought I was a traitor protecting my wife and a severely injured Robert who wanted me dead to protect his own ruin. As the agents moved to cuff me, I heard another sound, not sirens, not boots, but a gentle, almost hesitant knocking on the exterior window near the break room, the window that overlooked a narrow, shadowed alley. The agents froze, their training kicking in instantly. They knew this wasn't the expected police backup. They turned as one towards the sound, weapons shifting focus from me to the shadowy glass. The lead agent moved cautiously toward the window, pulling back the blinds a fraction of an inch. He scanned the alleyway, finding nothing but shadows and overflowing dumpsters. False alarm, he muttered, turning back. Let's get him secured. But as he turned, the other agent, the one who'd secured the ledger, sucked in a sharp breath. He pointed a trembling finger at the window pane the lead agent had just pulled the blind away from. Etched lightly into the dust of the interior glass, as if scratched by a fingernail, was a single, hastily drawn image. A crude outline of the German drill, underneath it, a single looping initial. E. Eleanor hadn't gone to Zurich. She had never left the building. She had used the pre-arranged communication channel, the very one Robert thought was his insurance against Sarah, to signal her position to the actual federal agents who were tracking her, not Robert or me. She was hiding somewhere in this labyrinthine industrial complex, waiting for the diversion to clear, and she had left that symbol as a mocking confirmation for the men tracking her, knowing they would find Robert and me first. The lead agent spun around, his face pale with professional failure. "She's still here. Seal the exits. Every man finds a secondary point of egress now." They abandoned the arrest of Robert and me. The supposed murder-suicide plot dissolved by the revelation of a larger, unseen game. They were scrambling, running for the back exits, desperate to find the real prize. I stood alone in the wreckage of the office, the useless pistol still at my feet, the broken recorder smoking softly on the desk. Robert was groaning near the wall, forgotten. I looked towards the hallway leading deeper into the complex, a maze of storage rooms and locked utility closets that Robert used for overflow inventory. If Eleanor was still in the building and she was working with the feds, she was clearly the one in control. But why would she let me walk away alive? I looked at the dust-covered etch mark on the window, the initial E. And then I noticed something else, something impossible. Deep beneath the E, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was a second, smaller inscription, scratched right next to the first. It was a single perfect depiction of a coffee bean, my coffee bean. The tiny, personalized logo Eleanor had insisted on putting on the bottom of every mug she ever gave me. It wasn't a sign to the feds. It was a sign for me. It meant she was coming for me. But why? Was it a rescue or a final cleanup? As the sounds of armed agents sweeping the far corridors faded slightly, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible click from the utility closet door right behind me, the one Robert had been using to store his seasonal decorations. It was the sound of a heavy-duty lock disengaging from the inside. The click from the utility closet was softer than the snap of the pistol's misfire, yet infinitely more terrifying. It was deliberate, calculated, and aimed squarely at the space I currently occupied. I spun around, raising my empty hands, the remnants of the antique pistol now lying uselessly on the floor. The door eased open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness, and from that narrow aperture, a voice emerged, calm, familiar, and utterly devoid of the warmth I'd associated with it for 3 decades. "Don't move, George. I didn't want this mess, but you always insisted on keeping things complicated." It was Eleanor. Not the frantic fugitive the feds were hunting, but the quiet mastermind operating within their blind spot. "Zurich?" I managed, the word catching in my throat. "The jet?" Eleanor stepped fully into the lamplight. She wasn't wearing the expensive silk blouse I'd last seen her in. She was clad in dark, functional gear, a lightweight vest beneath a plain utility jacket, her movements economical, her eyes sharp and focused, entirely unlike the worried wife who'd been brewing my coffee that morning. In her hand she held not a weapon, but a sleek, modern tablet, displaying a live feed of the tactical team sweeping the east wing of the building. The jet was the spectacle, George. Robert's suicide attempt was the smokescreen. Your son-in-law's incompetence and Robert's greed were the tools I provided them both. You were just too busy defending yourself against a frame job to notice the real architecture being built around you. She gestured to the ledger, still open on the desk. Those aren't just defense schematics, George. They are the blueprints for the next generation of secure communication hardware. Robert was selling them off piece by piece, using our company as the front. The feds were hunting the seller, Robert. I was hunting the asset, the original, complete documentation that you unknowingly compiled through your old contracts. She looked at Robert, still semi-conscious on the floor, and dismissed him with a slight curl of her lip. He gets to be a martyr for corporate espionage. You were supposed to be my partner in the clean transition, George. When you refused to sign those final papers last year, the ones transferring your half of the assets before the schematics surfaced, you became a liability. The trust fund, I whispered, connecting the final devastating dots. You weren't protecting me from my own fraud. You were protecting your access to my assets from the government. Exactly, she confirmed, tapping the tablet screen. The feds, my contacts, get their intellectual property back via Robert's demise. I get full untaxed control of everything you ever built, legally absolved of any wrongdoing through a very specific prenuptial clause your own lawyer drafted 10 years ago. It was all contingent on the discovery of unreported international holdings. She walked past me, not touching me, moving toward the door where the tactical team was converging. The coffee bean, that was my insurance policy for you. When they find you alive, and they will, because I need you to testify that Robert acted alone in the fraud, you will be given a very compelling plea deal. Full immunity, a small managed payout, and your freedom. You walk away with nothing but your life, George. But you walk. She paused at the doorway, looking back at me one last time. The lamplight illuminated her face, and for a fleeting second the old Eleanor flickered, a ghost of regret crossing her features. The only thing I couldn't control was your loyalty to your daughter. Sarah tried to stop me this morning when she saw the Fed team mobilize. She genuinely thought I was going to hurt you, George. I had to lock her in the garage safe, but she's safe. The code is encrypted on that tablet. The roar of approaching boots was right outside the door. Eleanor didn't look scared. She looked expectant. Goodbye, George. She stepped out of the office, disappearing into the hall, moments before the federal agents flooded the room. They ignored Robert, who was still babbling incoherently, and they ignored the broken pistol. All eyes fixed on me, the last person standing near the evidence. "George Sterling!" the lead agent barked, shoving a pair of heavy, cold handcuffs onto my wrists. "You are under arrest for corporate espionage and accessory to murder. Cooperate and your wife's deal is valid. Resist and you take the fall for all of it." As they dragged me out past the utility closet, the sirens outside starting to shift their tone. Less pursuit, more containment. I saw it. Hanging innocently on the inside of the utility closet door, right where Eleanor must have placed it when she left, was my favorite slightly chipped ceramic coffee mug, and tucked neatly into the handle, secured with a twist of thin wire, was the key card to the staging yard, the one the second thief had used to open the gate. It was completely clean, wiped of any trace of fingerprints, but etched into the plastic, visible only in the precise way the light caught it, was a single, fresh scratch mark, the initial of my son-in-law, Mark. Eleanor hadn't just secured her assets. She had ensured that Mark, already compromised and desperate, would be the one the feds found holding the incriminating drill kit when they inevitably searched the surrounding area. Mark hadn't just been a pawn. He was the final, sacrificial offering to guarantee everyone else walked clean. I was arrested, ruined, and staring down federal prison, all while the real architect of my downfall, my wife, was walking free, holding the keys to my future, and my daughter was still locked somewhere in the garage, a prisoner of her own mother's ruthlessness. My victory over Mark and Robert had simply cleared the stage for the final and most devastating betrayal.